The night was thick and oppressive, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and damp, as if even nature held its breath in trepidation. The moon, shrouded by ghostly wisps of cloud, cast only a pale, muted light on the landscape, illuminating the traveler's solitary path in eerie, silvery hues. He walked alone, his steps echoing in the dead silence, swallowed almost immediately by the dense fog that clung to him like a shroud. The fog was thick, crawling along the ground and winding around his legs like skeletal fingers, as if it wished to hold him in place, to keep him on this path for eternity. On either side of the road, twisted, ancient trees rose from the fog like specters, their barren, claw-like branches reaching up toward the darkened sky. Shadows danced within the trees, twisting and bending with the movement of the mist, and the traveler couldn't help but feel as though hidden eyes were watching him from within those depths, following his every move in the oppressive silence. The world around him was muted. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl were entirely absent. There was nothing, only silence, a silence so profound it felt unnatural, as though the very earth had gone still in dread. The traveler tightened his grip on the worn edges of his coat, pulling it closer around himself as a shiver ran down his spine. The air was frigid, yet he felt a different kind of chill, one that crept under his skin, gnawing at his bones, filling him with a slow-growing dread. His breath formed faint clouds in the icy air, vanishing almost instantly into the mist, as though the night itself absorbed every trace of warmth, every sign of life. Despite his determination to press forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow moving in circles. The road before him appeared endless, stretching on into the fog with no end in sight, while every step felt strangely futile, as though he were simply treading the same ground over and over again. His mind, already weary from hours of walking, played tricks on him. He thought he saw shapes moving in the mist, figures shifting just beyond the edge of his vision, disappearing the moment he turned to look. An overwhelming sense of isolation gnawed at him. The road, with its eerie stillness, felt not just empty, but forsaken, as though no living soul had trodden this path in decades. It was a place that time had forgotten, a place where the living were not welcome. The fog continued to thicken, enveloping him in a dense, suffocating cocoon, his tendrils cold and damp against his skin. It was as if the mist itself held a dark consciousness, watching, waiting, whispering secrets just out of reach. He tried to shake off his unease, to remind himself that he was merely passing through. Yet, with each step, the feeling of dread intensified, sinking deeper into his chest. The road felt cursed, tainted by some ancient sorrow, and he could feel its darkness clinging to him, like a shadow that would follow him forever. In the pit of his stomach, a strange heaviness settled, a primal fear that he was not alone, that something lurked just beyond the veil of fog, watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As he continued down the path, he became acutely aware of his own heartbeat, a steady, thunderous sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. His pulse quickened with each step, and with every beat, he felt as though he were drawing closer to something unknown, something ominous. The shadows around him grew darker, the trees appearing more twisted and grotesque, their limbs stretched out like arms reaching for him, their gnarled forms a testament to the horrors that might have unfolded in this forsaken place. Then, in the distance, a strange shape emerged, barely visible through the layers of mist. A dark silhouette standing perfectly still in the center of the road, as if waiting for him. He stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. The figure was motionless, shrouded in darkness, its features hidden beneath a hooded cloak that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows. It stood silently, facing him, as if it had been expecting him, as though it had been waiting here on this lonely, desolate path for a very long time. The traveler felt an instinctive urge to turn back, to to flee from this figure and the palpable sense of foreboding it exuded. But his feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and curiosity, as though some unseen force compelled him to move forward, to face whatever this dark presence had in store. The air around him grew colder, the mist thickening, pressing in on him from all sides, making it difficult to breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet he found himself drawn toward the figure, unable to resist the pull. As he took a hesitant step forward, the figure's hood shifted slightly, and though he could see no face, he felt the weight of its gaze, sharp and piercing, boring into him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. His breath hitched, his pulse thundered, and he knew, in that moment, that his life was about to change forever. The road was silent, the fog heavy, the darkness impenetrable. As he took another step closer to the stranger who waited for him in the shadows, the figure stood unmoving in the middle of the road, draped in a long, black cloak that seemed to devour the faint moonlight, casting an unnatural darkness around him. The fog wrapped itself around the stranger like a second skin, making him appear as though he had risen straight from the shadows, an apparition born from the mist. His presence was so ominous, so out of place in the stillness of the night, that the traveler felt an instinctive chill, a primal dread that froze him in his tracks. He couldn't see the stranger's face, its features hidden deep within the hood's shadow, but the darkness beneath was too deep, too absolute, as if there was no face at all, only a hollow void. The traveler's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence, filling his mind with a growing sense of terror. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of something incomprehensible and terrible. When the stranger spoke, his voice was like the crackling of dead leaves underfoot, low and dry, carrying a whisper of decay. The voice was barely more than a murmur, yet it cut through the night with a dreadful clarity, each word seeming to sink into the fog and linger in the chill air. "Good evening, traveler," the stranger said, his tone cold and hollow, devoid of warmth or familiarity. It was a voice that seemed to echo from some distant, forgotten place, an ancient darkness that had waited centuries to speak. The traveler felt his throat tighten, fear stealing his voice, but he forced himself to respond, if only to prove he still could. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice a weak shadow against the weight of the stranger's presence. The stranger tilted his head slowly, almost in mockery, as though he found the question amusing. He took a step forward, the hem of his cloak whispering over the ground, gliding rather than walking, with an eerie, fluid motion that suggested he was something not bound by the laws of this world. The fog parted around him as he moved, leaving tendrils of mist trailing in his wake, like ghostly fingers grasping at his form. "It does not matter who I am," the stranger replied, his voice a hollow echo. "It matters only what I bring." The traveler swallowed, his mouth dry, a tremor running through him that he couldn't suppress. He could feel the stranger's gaze upon him, an invisible force that pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless, a gaze that saw everything, every fear, every doubt. He felt exposed, as though the stranger were peeling away the layers of his soul, uncovering all that he kept hidden, even from himself. What do you want from me?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely more than a whisper. The stranger lifted a gloved hand, long, slender fingers reaching out, though not to touch him. Instead, the hand hovered in the air between them, a gesture that seemed both a warning and a threat. The stranger's fingers curled slightly, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the traveler thought he saw dark, skeletal bones beneath the black leather, as though the hand were more shadow than flesh. "Do you believe in fate, traveler?" the stranger murmured, his tone laced with a dark amusement. The question hung in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on the traveler's mind like a weight he could not lift. The traveler hesitated, his heart pounding, his mind spinning as he searched for an answer. But before he could speak, The stranger continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, a sound that felt as cold as death itself. Fate is a chain, a thread that binds all lives to a final end. And yours is near. The traveler felt a shiver of terror slide down his spine, as if the words themselves had taken form, wrapping around him like an icy chain. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off as a cruel joke. But the conviction in the stranger's voice held him captive, filling him with a certainty that these were not idle words. They were a prophecy, dark and irrevocable. The stranger leaned closer, his hood dipping forward, obscuring his face even further, though the traveler could feel an unseen gaze burning into him, as if the very darkness within the hood was alive. Death does not come alone, the stranger continued, his words soft but sharp, like the edge of a blade. It hungers for the living, and soon, someone close to you, someone you cherish, will be its next feast. The traveler's heart clenched with fear, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to speak, to refute the stranger's words, but no sound would come. The stranger's presence was overwhelming, a cold, unyielding force that drained him of strength and resolve, leaving him hollow and defenseless. He could feel the prophecy sinking into his bones, a weight he would carry forever. "Do not fight it," the stranger whispered, his voice almost kind, yet laced with a mocking cruelty. "The path has already been set. The shadow has already begun to creep." A terrible silence fell between them, the weight of the stranger's words pressing down on the traveler, suffocating him with the certainty of what was to come. He could feel the ground beneath him growing colder, the chill seeping through his boots, creeping up his legs, until it seemed as though the very earth were reaching up to claim him. Who will it be?" the traveler managed to ask, his voice weak, trembling with desperation. The stranger's reply was a dark, hollow laugh, a sound that sent chills racing up the traveler's spine. "Is it not better not to know?" the stranger whispered, his voice like the rasp of old, brittle bones. "You will find out, in time." And with that, the stranger turned, his cloak sweeping through the fog in a swirl of darkness. He began to fade into the mist, his form dissolving into shadows, until only his voice remained, a disembodied whisper lingering in the air. "Remember, traveler, the end always comes, sooner than we think." And then he was gone, leaving the traveler alone on the desolate road, his mind haunted by the stranger's words, his soul heavy with the weight of a prophecy he could not escape. The fog closed in around him, thick and silent, as though the night itself had swallowed the stranger whole, leaving nothing behind but an emptiness that gnawed at the traveler's heart. The traveler stumbled forward, his steps unsteady, his mind spinning with fear and despair. The stranger's voice echoed in his ears, whispering of shadows and death, filling him with a dread that he knew would never leave him. He could feel the prophecy coiling around him like a serpent, a dark presence that would haunt him for the rest of his days. And as he continued down the road, he felt the shadows growing darker, the fog pressing in closer, and he knew, with a terrible certainty, that he would never escape the stranger's curse. The traveler staggered along the desolate road, his mind a chaotic whirlpool of fear and confusion. The stranger's words had settled within him like a dark spell, a curse that clung to his very soul. Every whispered syllable echoed in his thoughts, repeating the prophecy that had left him hollow and trembling. "One close to you will soon pass into the realm of the dead." Each word seemed to etch itself deeper into his mind, filling him with a dread he couldn't shake, a fear that grew colder with every step. He quickened his pace, as if distance from the encounter might somehow weaken its power. But his legs felt leaden, and the fog only thickened, enveloping him in a shroud of heavy silence. The air itself seemed to carry a weight, a sense of inevitability, as though the entire world had turned against him, conspiring to bring the prophecy to life. Shadows crept along the edges of his vision, twisting and shifting as he stumbled forward, each one reminding him of the stranger's silhouette, of the hollow, foreboding gaze that had seemed to peer straight into his soul. The traveler clenched his fists, struggling to breathe as his chest tightened, the chill of terror sinking deeper into his bones. A horrible certainty filled him, a sensation that something unseen was watching, stalking him from just beyond the reach of his senses. Every rustle of the wind through the trees, every faint shift of shadow felt like a whisper from the stranger, a reminder of what awaited him, a promise that death was already at his heels. He could see his village lights faintly in the distance now, but rather than bring comfort, they filled him with a sense of foreboding. The stranger's prophecy had tainted his once beloved home, turning it into a place of doom and despair. Images of his family and friends flickered in his mind, each face twisted with an expression of sorrow, pain, or worse, lifeless, with hollow eyes staring back at him in accusation. His mind was plagued by thoughts of how his loved ones might meet their end, scenarios both horrifying and surreal. The world around him seemed to transform, the familiar path growing strange and alien, as though the road itself were conspiring to drive him into madness. Every tree, every stone felt different, wrong, as if tainted by the stranger's curse. His footsteps became uneven, the road seeming to stretch and warp, twisting before him like a snake. The fog pressed in closer, swirling around him in dense, suffocating clouds, obscuring his vision and making it difficult to see even a few steps ahead. "Who?" he whispered aloud, his voice hoarse and trembling, his eyes wide with fear. "Who will it be?" But there was only silence, a silence so deep it felt as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the answer he dreaded. He thought of his mother, her kind, gentle face etched with lines of wisdom. He thought of his younger brother, his bright laughter echoing in his memory. He thought of his father, his sturdy hands and warm, protective presence. Each face flashed before him, vivid and alive, only to be replaced by the horrifying image of them pale and cold, lying silent and still. "No!" he cried, his voice breaking, but his plea was swallowed by the fog, the oppressive silence bearing down on him, crushing him under its weight. He clutched at his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. The prophecy had wrapped itself around him like a dark vine, creeping into every corner of his mind, growing stronger with each passing moment, feeding on his fear, his despair. He stumbled onward, his mind racing, desperately searching for a way to break free from the curse that had been thrust upon him. "Can't be true," he told himself. It was just a warning, just a game of words. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't escape the gnawing certainty that the stranger had seen something real, something inescapable. In his desperation, he found himself whispering frantic prayers, bargaining with unseen forces, offering up anything he could think of to spare his loved ones. "Take me instead," he muttered, his voice trembling with desperation. "Take me, just don't take them." But the silence offered no comfort, no answer, only the soft, eerie rustle of the wind through the trees, like a mocking echo of his despair. As he neared the edge of the village, his legs heavy with exhaustion, a final horror struck him. What if the curse had already begun? What if, even now, someone he loved was slipping away, drawn into the darkness by a force he couldn't see, couldn't fight? The thought was too much to bear, and he broke into a run, stumbling and panting, his feet pounding against the earth as he raced through the fog, driven by a terror that bordered on madness. The village was eerily silent as he arrived, its familiar streets veiled in shadow, every corner holding the potential for hidden horrors. Doors and windows were shut tight, as though the buildings themselves sensed the darkness that had followed him, sealing themselves away from the curse that clung to him. The traveler stopped in the middle of the street, his gaze darting wildly from one house to the next, his heart hammering as he imagined what might await him behind each door. He reached his own doorstep, hesitating, his hand hovering over the doorknob, paralyzed by the fear of what he might find inside. A cold sweat trickled down his spine, and he swallowed, his throat dry as sand. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of doom that settled deep in his chest. Heavy and relentless, summoning his courage, he pushed open the door, stepping into the darkened house. The air was thick, still, as if time itself had paused, holding its breath along with him. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the faint light of a single candle flickering in the corner. The silence was absolute, pressing down on him like a weight, each step echoing in the darkness. He made his way through the house, his eyes straining to pierce the shadows, searching for any sign of life. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent his heart racing. His nerves frayed to the breaking point. He reached the doorway to his mother's room, his hand trembling as he pushed it open, bracing himself for the worst. But she was there, peacefully asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Relief flooded through him, but only for a moment. The prophecy was not specific. It did not name its victim. He couldn't know who would fall or when it would happen. The stranger's curse had left him to wait, to live in constant fear, haunted by a fate that could strike at any moment. As he stood there, staring down at his mother's sleeping form, the weight of his despair grew heavier. He felt the curse settling over him like a shroud, wrapping itself around him, binding him to a future filled with dread and uncertainty. The stranger's words had become a part of him, a dark shadow that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would never escape it. Days passed in a haze of restless anxiety and sleepless nights. The traveler's mind remained haunted, his thoughts consumed by the prophecy. He could not escape the stranger's words, which lingered like a dark incantation in the corners of his mind. One close to you will soon pass into the realm of the dead. The once familiar world around him felt warped, twisted, as though some unseen darkness had seeped into every shadow, turning his life into a waking nightmare. He was plagued by visions, brief flashes in his mind of loved ones pale and lifeless, their eyes wide open, staring at him from beyond, hollow and accusing. He grew fearful of everything around him, watching each of his family members with a desperate intensity, fearing that, at any moment, one of them would simply slip away, taken by the dark prophecy that clung to him like a curse. Every cough, every wince, every small accident was enough to send him spiraling into terror, his mind leaping to conclusions he could scarcely bear. Unable to bear the constant strain any longer, he resolved to find the stranger once more. He needed to confront him, to ask him if there was any way to break free from this dark fate. The thought of seeing that shadowy figure again filled him with dread, but his need for answers was stronger. The traveler retraced his steps back to the desolate road where he had first encountered the figure, the road where the fog had seemed to move with a life of its own, where the night itself had whispered of despair. It was an icy, moonless night when he set out, a night where even the stars hid themselves behind a thick blanket of clouds. The fog was already rolling in as he walked, swirling around his ankles, twisting and coiling like a serpent, urging him forward with a silent, invisible force. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had ceased its mournful wail, leaving only the faint crunch of his boots on the gravel as he made his way through the mist. The road stretched on before him, an endless ribbon of shadow winding into the fog. With every step, his heart pounded louder, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger, an oppressive weight pressing down on him. His eyes scanned the darkness ahead, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the stranger's presence. He felt as though he were walking into a trap, a web of shadows and silence woven just for him. And then, just as he began to lose hope, he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, cloaked in darkness, a silhouette carved out of the mist. The traveler's breath caught, his body frozen with fear, but he forced himself to move closer. As he approached, he realized with a jolt that something was wrong. Terribly, inexplicably wrong. This time, the figure did not stand as the stranger had, shrouded in shadows, hood pulled low. This time, the figure was different, familiar. It wore the same black cloak, but as he drew nearer, the hood slipped back, revealing not the faceless void of the stranger, but a face he knew all too well. It was his mother. The traveler's heart lurched as he recognized her features. Though they were pale, gaunt, and drained of life, her eyes, which had once sparkled with warmth and kindness, now stared at him with a chilling emptiness. Wide and unblinking, the pupils dark voids that seemed to pierce his soul. Her skin was ashen, her lips pale and cracked, her face devoid of the warmth he had always known. She looked as though she had been dead for days, her flesh sunken, shadowed by dark, hollow lines. "Mother?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, his body trembling with horror. He reached out a shaking hand, but stopped himself, frozen by the unnatural stillness of her form. She did not respond, did not blink, did not even breathe. Her mouth opened slowly, and though her lips never moved, he heard her voice, faint and hollow, like an echo from another world. "You were warned." The traveler stumbled back, his mind reeling as he tried to process the horror before him. This was no vision, no hallucination born of his fear. This was real, too real, and the prophecy had come alive before his very eyes. His mother's face was twisted, frozen in an expression of despair and accusation. Her eyes locked onto his, staring into him with a cold, relentless gaze that seemed to burn with unspeakable sorrow. "No, this can't be," he gasped, his voice choked with terror. "You're not. You can't be." But the figure remained, unmoving, staring back at him with that same empty gaze. She raised a hand, her fingers curled and skeletal, as though reaching out to him, beckoning him forward. Her voice, faint and distant, echoed in his mind, though her lips never moved. "You cannot escape what is meant to be. I am only the beginning." The fog grew denser, swirling around them both, creating a barrier of shadows and mist that enclosed them in a silent, claustrophobic void. The traveler felt as though he were sinking, his body numb with fear, his mind gripped by a terror so profound it left him paralyzed. He tried to tear his gaze away from his mother's face, but her eyes held him captive, filled with a depth of sorrow and darkness that reached beyond life, beyond death. As he looked closer, he began to see faint, dark shapes shifting in the fog behind her, other figures, other faces. He recognized them, each one a loved one, each face twisted in the same expression of despair, each pair of hollow eyes staring at him, unblinking, silent. His father, his brother, his friends, all of them were there, their ghostly forms drifting in the shadows, watching him, accusing him. He was surrounded, hemmed in by the faces of those he loved most, each one a silent reminder of the fate that awaited them. He took a stumbling step backward, his mind screaming with terror, his heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from his chest. He wanted to turn, to run, but the fog pressed in on him from all sides, thick and impenetrable, trapping him in a prison of shadows. His mother's face was closer now, her hand reaching out to him, her eyes wide and unseeing, yet filled with an agony that seemed to pierce his very soul. "Why?" he whispered, his voice broken, his hands shaking as he backed away. "Why are you doing this?" The answer came, not from her lips, but from the shadows themselves, a voice low and hollow, echoing from every corner of the mist. "Because you must know. You must know what is to come." The traveler felt his strength draining away, his mind unraveling as he stared into the eyes of his mother, into the faces of his loved ones, all of them condemned to a fate he could not prevent, could not escape. The prophecy had come alive, the curse binding him to a future he could neither understand nor alter. He was trapped, helpless, as the faces of those he cherished most drifted closer, their hands reaching out to him, their hollow eyes pleading with him, accusing him, haunting him. He collapsed to his knees, his head in his hands, his body shaking as he wept, the weight of the prophecy crushing him under its terrible certainty. The last thing he saw before the fog swallowed him whole was his mother's face, her hand brushing against his cheek, her voice a whisper in the darkness. "We are waiting for you." And then the world went black, the fog closing in, sealing him in a prison of silence and shadow, a fate bound by the prophecy that would haunt him for all eternity.